the Roland Jupiter 4 Compuphonic. It behaves like it's got a computer in, but I doubt it does. What makes this special in its time was its ability to remember different sounds and to recall them at the flick of a switch. So we've got our manual stuff here where you can fiddle around with your various different controllers. The minute you switch it into, say, the bass, amazing sounding instrument, this is rendered useless. Now, there is a write button where I could start from scratch in manual mode, go, well, that sounds nice. I want to write it to one of the 8 different programmable patches here, but my write button doesn't seem to be working. However, when you use the presets, although this programmable element is disabled, we have these areas here, which are crucial to where this keyboard sits in the timeline of synthesizers. So we've got our bass, and we've got our string. And one of the reasons I love using vintage kit is you not only get a sense of how things sounded back then and that wonderful kind of vintage analog sound that we all so love, but also a sense of feeling. You can feel how these things were being used and where they sat in the progression of synthesizers. It's called a Jupiter 4 because it's 4-note polyphonic. Now, unlike the Juno 6, which I reviewed recently, linked in the video description down below, you don't get something called channel stealing. That's because the oscillators are all analog and the control is analog, whereas the Juno has digitally controlled oscillators. So in order to get that note out when you're playing these 4, you have to let go of another. We've got our funky clavinet. A piano. You see, all sorts of weird stuff happens when you use both hands. But I don't think this keyboard is designed to be used with both hands. The thing to remember with synthesizers is synthesizers and those things behind me, modular synths, are no different. You see all the spag that's hanging out of that. It just connects one module to another. The only difference with synthesizers is that spag is hard soldered inside the casing of the synthesizer. And what's really interesting about using this Jupiter compared to the Juno and synthesizers that followed is how they decided to wire it up. I've spent a whole day trying to get my head around this thing, realizing that the way other synths became wired was certainly not the way this was. And I think this one has been wired and designed so you don't use it with 2 hands, and which is why the stuff you want to do with your left hand is situated on this side of the keyboard, not over here. It's meant to be a voice. Playing with your right hand, modulating with your left, but also the build quality, which is so much better than the Juno 6. Metal, wood, nice chunky knobs, faders that don't move very easily, all point to it being designed for something specific. And that specificity is performance, is taking it on the road. This is a road-worthy synthesizer. Trombone. Uncanny. Saxophone. Somewhat flattering, I would say. Trumpet. I'll take you through all this in a minute. Finally, we have synth. And time force. Right, to the nuts and bolts. I'm going to put it into manual mode. Roland had a real sense of symmetry in those days, so it's 4-note polyphonic addressing 4 oscillators, which can be used in polyphony or all stacked on top of each other. On its own, stacked. Now if I put it into strings, so you can have those oscillators used one for each note, or you can have them stacked on top of each other, making this a monophonic keyboard. So, and you'll hear that phasing. That's 4 oscillators playing in unison. Now, if I use this second unison mode, what happens is it stacks all 4 oscillators on the single note, and when you start playing other notes, it basically steals from those. You'll hear the first note stops phasing so much and gets thinner in sound. And then we've got 2 polyphony modes. We've got full polyphony where just 1 oscillator, 2, 3, 4. And then we've got it when it assigns 2 oscillators to each note until you go past the 2 notes, at which point it starts stealing like the unison mode does. So slight phase there. Compare that between just 1 oscillator per note. And then you can hear the oscillators dropping off the lower note. It also has an ensemble feature, which is no competitor to the Juno 6 chorus. Right, manual mode. Let's start with the programmer section. So we have 4 types of oscillator. We've got the sine wave, triangle lead type of wave. We've got a square wave. And then pulse width, which goes from a square wave to various degrees of unevenness to give you a more rasping tone. So if we start with a pulse width that's almost even, and then we can create more disparity. We've also got range, and I love that they still measure that in feet like an organ. And if we switch this off, which is always, I think, what throws people about analog pieces of kit, is you can press a button that renders it completely useless, making you think that the thing's broken. And I'll switch on the sub, which is a lovely smooth sounding triangle wave. We have a noise generator. which doesn't key track. So that's the VCO, the voltage controlled oscillator. And unlike the Juno 6, which is a DCO, a digitally controlled oscillator, you will get little vagaries when you decide to do different things that change the way you're using this inner wired keyboard setup. So we first got our frequency section here, which is the voltage controlled frequency. So a high pass. So it affects all four oscillators and the sub. And then we've got our LPF, low pass filter. And some resonance here. There's a key follow thing which basically adjusts the amount of voltage going to the frequency module depending on the pitch. Slightly more subtle. Now I'm going to come back to the low frequency oscillator in a minute. Now this section can be modulated via the LFO, which is just situated here. So this is an oscillator that runs slower than hearing. So it's used to control as opposed to create pitch. So just like the other oscillators, you have different shapes. So you've got your sine wave, which is a smooth, continuous ramping up and down. And I can adjust the amount of voltage that's going from the LFO to the VCF with this knob here. And this controls the speed. And then we've got a square wave. The way the LFO works with the various different controllers, I think, is what makes this keyboard incredibly special. We've got a triangle going one way. And then the other way. And again, the amount that can affect the degree of modulation can be controlled by this. So we can temper this down. Has a magic to it, which is really just so wonderful to use. Now, it's not the only way that you can control the filter. You can also control it with this envelope here. However, I think it's easier to demonstrate how an envelope works with this voltage controlled amplifier. So basically you've got your oscillator going into your filter, which can be controlled by your LFO, and then it goes into your voltage controlled amplifier, which can also be controlled by this, but also has an envelope here, which basically controls how the voltage is sent into the amplifiers. So those oscillators, I know it's horrible to think that, but those four oscillators, they are running. We're not triggering them, we're not switching them on or off, they are on. All we're doing is opening a gate to let them through. And with this setting, you simply get a hard gate on and off. And when it's on, it stays on. When it's off, it stays off. Control the general level here. Now, if I were to slow the attack, we get that effect. Slow the release. It's really interesting how this works with the 4-note polyphony. Something that sparked a lot of debate on my last thing about the Juno 6 was me talking about why analog synths are easier to mix. Well, often it's about their voice polyphony. You don't get a build-up of notes, you don't get this sort of wash. So the effect of this patch is one of a slow attack and a slow release. However, when I start changing notes, you don't get that build-up of different notes all ringing out. So you're not getting all of that. That's interesting. Oh, I see. So the way that this polyphonic button works is that basically for every note that you add, it uses a different oscillator. But it only ever uses 2 when you're playing 2 notes, or indeed 1 when you're playing 1. Whereas this setting, it assigns a different oscillator by order of note. And it's these behaviors that are done away with in virtual synth. So you get the sound, but you don't get the way in which it will alter your playing. Now, this is going to be a bold claim, but with 4-note polyphony, with this kind of control of the release envelopes in these types of synthesizers, it really does away with the need for a sustain pedal. You have to be so much more considered with how you're controlling the sustain of each note and how those notes are overlapping. What happens when you take away the sustain pedal? Well, it's kind of like the reverse of what happens when you add a strap to a guitar. You can stand up. I think people started standing up in the 1980s because you didn't need a sustain pedal. And for anyone who's performed standing up playing a keyboard who uses a sustain pedal, you'll know not only how awkward it is, but what agony that you have in your right ankle after a gig because of that awkward thing of standing on something that you're also going like that to. So that's my claim, that people started standing up with keyboards when they went monophonic or certainly had limited polyphony. So the voltage-controlled filter can also be controlled by its own dedicated envelope. And I think it's a lot easier to hear what's going on there. And finally, the decay and sustain will give you quite a natural shape. So it attacks, hits a full level, and then you determine where it sustains to, whether that's all the way to the bottom or stays all the way up at the top, and how quickly it goes to that level. So with decay, let's do something extreme. So we've got an attack that's kind of medium, along with the release. But now what we're going to do is we're going to go to a sustain of nothing. But because this is very slow, it's taken a while to get there. The way this thing is wired up, it works really interestingly when you play a bunch of notes and use different lengths. This is what I'm talking about, the accuracy or different style of accuracy of playing that you would adopt with a piano, which is triggering something, a hammer banging a note. This thing is opening and closing circuits. So we've got so regardless of how long it stays sustained, it goes down to nothing there. But if I do a release like that, and that's what I mean about analog synths and the way they feel, this would have to, if you had it set up like this, it would have to alter the way in which you were playing. You see, nuts. So let's put that back into a... Now we can do exactly the same principle but with the filter. Let's put the amount that the envelope affects the filter, so the amount of general voltage that is taken from the envelope into the filter here, all the way. And we've got a kind of exactly the same pattern as here, on off. Now let's change the pattern for the filter compared to the amplifier. And you can inverse the attack becomes slow, etc., etc., which again can give you some interesting results. So other controls that we have is power, volume, which is not the same as the amplifier level. You can distort stuff internally with this if you push it hard enough. We've also at the front got tuning, again, a voltage controlled oscillator which will change depending on the atmospheric conditions. So you need it right next to you, your sound check, everything's great, gets nice and warm, the smoke machines go off, the hall becomes sweaty, you might need to adjust your tuning there. So that's very get-atable. And I think very telling that the Juno 6, okay, it had digitally controlled oscillators, but that tuning knob is at the back, not so get-atable. But this bit is where the fun begins. And this is the bit where, you know, this is years before MIDI. This is before they considered synthesizers to be something that just sat there in a studio, set and forget. This is not what the Jupiter 4 is about. It's about being able to recall sounds and then about being able to perform them with your spare hand, because this one has got all the notes this will give you. There's a handy button down here which turns on an arpeggiator. Let's turn the rate down. We've got up, down, up and down, and random. Oh, when you take them out, it does something very strange indeed. These can be controlled by an external clock, which is something I'll investigate with my wife's, is it a TR606? What's interesting here is we've got our LFO controlling the filter. but you can also control it from the arpeggiator. It gives us quite a confused sound. So cool. You see what I mean about there being a whole bunch of stuff wired into this filter, which can create all sorts of confusion. So I've got the envelope, the LFO, and the arpeggiator controlling the filter. But the amount of the filter is controlled by the arpeggiator is also affected by the amount the voltage affects the filter with the ADSR. I would love to work out the signal path of this. I imagine it's in its service manual to look at actually what order things fall in, or whether it's all done in parallel and just kind of summed at the filter stage. So let's take... So this is the LFO as we showed before, or we can have a square wave. But this controls a degree of delay. Comes in straight away. Comes in slowly. This seems to affect how wide, you can see that's connected, so normal wides. You can control the amount of voltage that controls the rate that controls the filter. And then if you make this wide, it goes bonkers. Almost to a frequency modulation. It's an enigma. Now on to this bit. This is pre-pitch bend modulation. Roland, I think, grudgingly gave you two controls, eventually by having a bend and a mod that was up and down. This basically is a controller that you can assign to various different jobs. So in a simple sense, let's make the bend address the oscillator amount, the amount of voltage the oscillator gets. And the bend sensitivity. it's got numbers on. They don't mean anything. They don't have any correlation with pitch or anything like that. So conversely, we can use the bender to address the VCF. And again, a little bit. And then we can use the bend to affect the volume. So this clearly adds voltage, this takes it away, as is with the bend. But we can also govern how much the LFO, this thing, modulates both the frequency, the amplifier, and the oscillator, which is when things start getting really confusing and when the complexity of sounds you can make are complex. Good? Who knows? So we've got our, when we take this down to bend, it's controlling the oscillator. When we put it up to LFO, it's definitely doing something with the voltage in there, but I don't think it's intentional. However, and if we turn up the LFO modulation, this will affect the amount that it modulates the oscillator. Like, again, sounds different. So what happens if you do both? Curious. We've got our filter. So that seems to completely change the shape of the LFO. I guess it's to do with the amount of voltage it's getting. And then the VCA. And finally, we have portamento. Basically means the voltage shifts gradually between the differentiation between notes, so less note voltage. So switch that on, make it nice and slow. So it must be oscillator dependent. So when it thinks you're using the same oscillator and there's a difference in voltage demanded, it graduates that voltage. It's really interesting, kind of automatically auto-arranges your legatos if you press the keys in a certain way. This works completely the opposite to how portamento usually works, where you have to join up the notes. With this, you've got to separate them. And then you have a transpose. Transposes the whole lot. It's just so beautiful. And it creates that degree of subtlety that gives it, that's without the fancy ensemble button on. So what I'm doing there is controlling both a little bit of the filter and a little bit of the oscillator to give it a bit of tuning. But these two are matching. So it'd be interesting maybe to have this just undulating like it's a weird bit of tape, and then to affect the LFO with the arpeggiator. And then have the bender affect the amplifier. Okay, what about if just a little bit of bend just attenuates the filter a bit, and then we've got the bend also shoving some LFO into the amplifier. I'm moving this bender just a tiny amount. If we pray to the reverb gods, what will that sound like? For me, it's not just sounding like, it's connecting with its place in history. Something that's been wired very differently to other synthesizers. Something that is pre-MIDI. Why would you attach MIDI to something like this? It is not how the thing has been wired up. This is not a set and forget. This is a noodle maker. This is you smacking on the reverb and bringing out your inner Tom York. Absolutely sensationally beautiful piece of kit that has fuck all to do with the way it sounds. It's the way they've plugged it up. It's mental. Thanks as always for watching to the end. I'm really enjoying these retro tech reviews and hope you are too. If there's anything that you spot in the building that you want me to review, I'd be happy to do so. And do fire along any questions you may have about this. And I guess if you've got a virtual version of this, heed to the way the original was wired. Reduce the polyphony down to 4 and wire in these different controllers and set your, whether it be a fader controller, so that they're controlling these different things. That way you'll get these little emotional nuances that we are as human beings trained to respond to. And it's that stuff. It's not just the frailty, the tuning and the scratchy pots that make vintage synths so attractive, or the richness of the oscillators. It's to do with the control they give you and how something like this was really a cul-de-sac of wiring, which they reversed out for with the Juno 6 just before the advent of MIDI, which is when they brought in the Juno 106 And that was the point at which you could move the synthesizer to the side and control it from somewhere else. You didn't need to get your hands on. And that's when they stopped making knobs that stayed on. You'll notice the Juno 6 has loads of missing ones. This doesn't, and it's considerably older. Anyway, do subscribe if you haven't done already, because there's lots more of these coming up and all sorts of resources and opportunities that we offer at Crow Hill. Ding the bell to be notified the next time we put a bell up. And one of these helps our algorithm. We're a young business, so these things help. Thank you in advance for your support.